fire, ice, thunder, wind, earth, water, light, darkness. Elements like these are often present in various RPGs. They add a layer of strategy by adding vulnerabilities and resistances to enemies and party members. The last story has elements in this battle system. They seem to be often misunderstood by new players, so today I'll try my best to clarify all these depths once and for all. The other very cool thing about elements in this game is that they add a layer to the lore of the world as well. This is hard to notice on a first or even second playthrough unless you're really paying attention to what things have certain elements. So we'll begin with the basics for combat and then we'll analyze each element and its lore implications. There are 6 elements in the last story: ice, fire, light, darkness, star, and nature. All the enemies in the game are aligned with one of these elements. Like I said in my bestiary video, the elemental alignment mostly tells you what the enemy is weak against. Elements are in fact paired like so. Ice is weak against fire, and vice versa. Light is weak against darkness, and vice versa. And finally, star is weak against nature, and vice versa. When you hit an enemy with an attack of the opposing element, you will score an element hit, which boosts your damage. Element hits can be scored in different ways. You can attack it with a weapon imbued with an element from a magic circle. You can attack with a weapon who inherently has an element in it. You can cast a spell. And finally, you can cause elemental damage by using certain environmental objects, such as the braziers that can be knocked over. Hitting an enemy with the same element it's aligned with does not do reduced damage. This is a common misconception, usually coming from people who have played several RPGs in the past, who assume that because 2 elements are weak against each other, then automatically it makes them resistant to themselves. It does not work this way in the last story. So how does it work? What happens if you hit an enemy with an element which is not weak against? It depends what the source of the element was. For weapons which are inherently imbued with an element, they do normal grey numbers unless they're hitting the elemental weakness, in which case they score element hits and get the damage boost from it. Weapons that are imbued with an element from a magic circle will do colored damage numbers based on the element. Red for fire, blue for ice, etc. and get a 1.2 damage boost or 20%. To reinforce my point, this also happens if you're hitting an ice enemy with a weapon which has been imbued with ice from an ice magic circle. Spells work just like elemental weapons. They score element hits only if they're hitting the elemental weakness. Now let's get to another easily misunderstood topic: elemental absorption. There are certain enemies in the last story who absorb certain elements, meaning that instead of taking damage, they get healed. This is signaled by the damage number appearing in green to the right of the enemy's health bar instead of on top. There's another big common misconception about elemental absorption made by new players. As soon as they see that the ice-aligned sea reptiles can absorb ice, they assume all ice enemies absorb ice, which is wrong. Elemental absorption isn't defined by the elemental alignment, it's just a unique property of certain enemies. Sea reptiles, for example, absorb ice damage, but all other reptiles, also aligned with ice, don't absorb ice. The Gurak Fire Sorcerer absorbs fire, but not other Gurak does, even though almost all of them are aligned with fire. If you need to know whether an enemy absorbs an element, scan it in Seek mode. You can also look at my bestiary video, where I point out every single enemy that can absorb an element and which element they absorb. But then what about an elemental weapon which is imbued with an element from a magic circle? The element from the magic circle usually takes priority. Let me give you an example. I'm finding a sea reptile which absorbs ice. If I have a Sunblade which is fire elemental, and it gets imbued with ice, the sea reptile will just absorb the damage. When the elemental buff runs out, it will take element hits. On the contrary, if I'm using a Fang, which is ice elemental, and step in a fire circle, the sea reptile will take element hits until the elemental buff runs out, after which it will absorb the damage again. What if the enemy is weak against the weapon element, but not the imbued one from the magic circle? Simple, just do element hits with a damage boost and ignore the imbued element. Isn't weak against any of the two? Then do standard 1.2 damage of the imbued element. Easy as that. Now, 2 more things about absorption. 1. If an enemy stands into a magic circle of the element it absorbs, then it will absorb the damage over time and get healed over time, just like a heal circle would do, except that the regen will stop immediately if the enemy exits the circle. Second, enemies who are hit by attacks that they absorb do not get staggered, pushed, or interrupted. However, if you hit an enemy which is low enough on HP to receive a critical finish with the element it absorbs, you will still do the critical finish animation, just the enemy won't die. Now that we have established how elements interact with each other in combat, let's take a look at the 6 elements one by one. See what enemies are aligned with each element, what weapons and magic use that element, and the lore behind them. Ice. Ice is opposite to fire and is associated with the magic Ice, Blizzard, and Glacier, which inflict slip and slipfall. The player can cast ice magic with Lowell. Weapons that inherently deal ice damage are the Fang with its evolution, Blue Blade and Black Hole, and the Nameless with its evolution, the Nameless Nothingness. All reptiles are of the ice element. the only exceptions being the mutated gold reptids in Chapter 42, which are light element. Ice is also associated with enemies linked to water. Muruks, krakens, and crabs are all ice. There are several enemies that can absorb ice. All sea reptids, the ice Muruk found in Arena Season 2, some Gurak ice sorcerers, and finally the Kraken and Berserk Kraken bosses. Fire. Fire is opposite to ice and is associated with the Flare, Prominence, Meteor, and Big Bang spells, which inflict break and armor break. The player can cast fire spells with Uric. Weapons that inherently deal fire damage are the Flame Reptid and the Karma, with its evolutions the Sunblade and the Starburst. Knocking over braziers also does fire damage on impact and leaves a flare circle on the ground. All Gurak and Gurak related enemies like ogres and worms are aligned with the fire element. Marbas, Zangrak's pet tiger, is also fire. There is only one Gurak that isn't fire but ice. That's the ice casting Gurak ice sorcerer. Spider enemies are also fire elemental, although they don't quite relate to the Gurak like ogres do. Or do they? After all, 3 spiders pop out of boxes in Chapter 11 inside the Gurak warship. The only explanation I can come up with this is that the Gurak tendency to train monsters to fight with them. We see that with the Gurak beasts and ogres. The Gurak captain in Chapter 11 summons a Muruk which goes wild and doesn't listen to him. It might be due to the fact that the Muruk isn't fire element but ice. This brings me to the spiders in the boxes. Maybe they were trying to train spiders to fight alongside them? And when the monster spider attacks the party in Chapter 36, it fights us along some Guraks, so maybe they were successful? One fire enemy unrelated to the Gurak is the Queen of the Abyss worshipped by the Reptids. But that's not even a Reptid type to begin with, so were the Reptids worshipping some kind of ancient Gurak? Who knows? Enemies which can absorb fire are rare. Only some Gurak fire sorcerers can do that, and they're first found in Chapter 35. Light. Light is opposite to darkness and is associated with Oli and Shining, which inflict barrier and deflector on the party, enhancing defenses and nullifying arrow-like attacks. The player can cast light magic with Callista. Light is also an element associated with the House of Arganan and the Knights of Lazarus. The Arganan dagger has inherent light damage, as does the Sanctuary, a weapon dropped by a Reptid gladiator fought under the Arganan castle, which we can assume it stole during the break-in. Lazarus Knights all wield the Paladin, which has inherent light element when used by the player at +5. There is one enemy type in the game that can absorb light, the Gold Reptids found in Chapter 42. This chapter incidentally takes place in the old Arganan temple, so we can theorize that these enemies got their light element because they lived there for a long period of time. Callista mentions that the last time she entered the temple she was just a little kid, meaning those monsters have probably lived there from 10 to 20 years. This is also where you find the Arganan dagger, which, as we said before, is light elemental. Darkness. Darkness is opposed to light, and it's aligned with the rabbit spell used by some enemies. This spell is an AoE explosion that deals heavy damage but leaves no magic circle. The player cannot access any spell to cast the darkness element. The only way that the player has to deal darkness damage is through the weapon's Zoran sword and its evolution the Sixfold Fiend, which possesses inherent darkness element. It's also very rare to score an element hit with darkness, as the only light enemies in the game, as we said, are present in Chapter 42 and nowhere else. Darkness is associated with death, shadows, and mind control. All skeleton-like enemies are darkness elemental and can also absorb darkness. The Stoneblade enemies in Chapter 18 are undead of the darkness element and inflict petrify when they hit you with their dagger. Other major enemies of the darkness element are the Terracors, Neberus, the Minor Shade and Shade bosses, and finally the Necromancer boss and the mages in the Path of Darkness. Speaking of this area, all enemies here are darkness elemental, and completing the area gives you your first light elemental weapon, the Paladin, which can symbolize the reward for overcoming the darkness. Mind control in darkness enemies is seen in multiple instances. The 2 Shade bosses can take over your party members. The Dark Muruk, which is not darkness but ice, can also do an attack with the same effect. The Necromancer boss summons skeleton enemies to do its bidding, and we can probably assume that the big skeletons in the Path of Darkness are controlled by the mages. Star. Star is opposed to nature, and there are no known spells of the star element. Neither the enemies or the player have access to star magic. However, there are 3 weapons that can inflict star elemental damage: the Fallen Angel, the Lapis Lazuli, and the Stranger. The star element is associated with the power of the Outsider and, to an extent, with the House of Arganan, which controls the Outsider. In the game there are only a few enemies with the star element. The Tracers first fought in the Place of Secrets, the mini golems and golems found in the Last World, the Cocoon boss, Sentinel Mitra, Sentinel Atar, and the final boss. All of these have a very close relation to the Outsider, each one for a different reason. As for the weapons, the Fallen Angel is given to the player by none other than Count Arganan himself. Also, the Gathering Skeletons in the part of the Realm of Ascendancy wield a weapon similar to the Fallen Angel. It makes sense because this place also has a close relation with the Outsider. You even find another star weapon here, the Lapis Lazuli. And finally, the Stranger is obtained by evolving the Chaos Blade, dropped by the boss Barith, found one room before where the Argana Self of the Outsider resides. And what do you need to evolve the Chaos Blade into the Stranger? Heart of the Outsider, of course. Nature. Nature is opposed to Star and it's aligned with the Leaf and Forest spells, which cause Silence and Long Silence. The player can cast nature spells with Mirania. Weapons that inherently deal nature damage are the Guardian Blade and its evolution the Guardian Fang, the Grandswell and its evolution the Wooden Grand, and finally the Ogre Hammer has a 10% chance to deal an additional nature-based attack. Nature is associated with humans, the land of the planet, and its guardians. All human enemies like the Knights, Bandits, and Assassins are nature element. The Cougars and the White Tiger Guardian boss met in the beginning of the game are also of the nature element. Cougars are being tied to the Guardians of the Land, and all Guardian Blades in the game are in fact protected by some Cougars. The ones in Lazulus, the ones in Mysterious Forest, and the ones at the top of the Tower of Trials during a replay. The other weapon with the nature element, the Grandswell, and its evolution the Wooden Grand, also has ties to nature and animals. It's dropped by the Kraken boss and its effect ignores the Guard of Spider enemies. Because nature represents the planet and Star represents the Outsider, which is a powerful source of magic, it makes sense that the nature magic inflicts silence, which blocks the casting of magic. It's like the planet using its own magic trying to fight against the powerful magic of the Outsider. Well, that was all about elements. Hopefully this clarified some of the doubts about the element system of the last story, and now you'll be able to maximize your damage output by taking advantage of it. The element hit damage boost is very good, and sometimes it's worth changing to a less powerful weapon if it means a constant damage increase. As per usual, like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't. If you want to see more of the last story content, subscribe, comment, join the Discord in the description, you know the drill, feed the YouTube algorithm, and as always, see you all in the next one.